The very concept of musical genres is dying, or at least that's the premise of the latest video by my friend Noah, better known around these parts as Polyphonic. But what does that mean? What even is a genre? Like, how do you know that this isn't metal?
But it was not your fault but mine, and it was your heart on the line.
Okay, fine, that's an easy one. Even if you barely know anything about metal, you can probably tell instinctively that Mumford & Sons isn't it. But what about a more interesting edge case, like, say, Ghost? Is this metal?
You go down just like Holy Mary, Mariana Cross.
Why or why not? This time there are good arguments in both directions. But whatever your instinct is, you can't really prove it without defining what it means to be metal, or to be part of any genre. And that's getting increasingly hard to do. Over the last few decades, we've seen more and more artists ambitiously blending styles to create undefinable new sounds, while listeners are inventing increasingly narrow microgenres with tightly defined rules to fit those artists into. That's what Noah's video is about, and he's right, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't make things just a little more complicated. You see, partway through, Noah brings up a paper by musicologist Franco Fabri called A Theory of Musical Genres, Two Applications, and then he says this.
It's an interesting paper if you've got the stomach for this sort of academic language, but I don't really. I have no delusions about the fact that I am not an academic. So if you want to dive more into this, ask 12 Tone or something.
I've never been one to back down from a challenge, so yeah, sure. I'll do it. In order to prove once and for all that I'm the better, smarter, and handsomer co-host of our podcast Ghost Notes, available wherever podcasts are found, I will defeat Noah in video essayist combat by explaining Fabri's paper and asking if the reports of genre's death are maybe a little premature. This video is sponsored by Nebula. Get 40% off an annual subscription with the link in the description. Let's start with a brief digression. Why should we care what a genre is? And the simple answer, to me, is that we care about genres. We identify with them, maybe less so these days, but for most of the 20th century, a lot of people, especially young people, defined their identities in no small part based on what genres of music they enjoyed. You had the mods and rockers, the metalheads, jazz cats, punks, hip-hop heads, and whatever fans of mid-century crooners called themselves. Croon dogs? I hope it wasn't croon dogs. These days we mostly see this sort of thing in relation to specific artists, like with the Swifties or the Juggalos, and of course that's not new either, just ask the Beatles. But the point is, genres aren't just arbitrary marketing labels. They're a part of who we are, and they're a huge part of how we understand music. And that's what Fabri was trying to explain. He starts off with a pretty simple one-sentence definition. According to Fabri, a genre is
a set of musical events, real or possible, whose course is governed by a definite set of socially accepted rules.
But like any good academic, he then goes on to painstakingly define basically every word in that sentence. I'm not going to do all of them, but I do want to go through the definitions for some of the more important ones, starting with the word music. This is a big deal. When we talk about musical genre, do we just mean the way things sound, or is there more going on? That depends on our definitions. But defining music is a famously difficult problem. I don't want to get sidetracked with arguments about whether the one I chose is correct, so I'm going to give you a handful of options. You can pick whichever you like, or bring one from home if you've got a favorite. Each definition has its pros and cons, and each one will have different implications for how we interpret the rest of Fabri's argument, but any of them will work as a starting point. I'll try to present these in order from most to least restrictive, starting with the new Oxford American Dictionary, the one that came installed on my computer. That says music is
vocal or instrumental sounds, or both, combined in such a way as to produce beauty of form, harmony, and expression of emotion.
And that's fine. It's pretty straightforward, and it does capture most of our day-to-day experience of music, especially since most questions about genre are largely referring to relatively mainstream popular music. But it does encode some pretty significant cultural assumptions, like the presence of harmony and the desire for beauty, neither of which are universal to the musical experience. If we want a slightly less judgy definition, we could also use dictionary.com, which says it's
an art of sound in time that expresses ideas and emotions in significant forms through the elements of rhythm, melody, harmony, and color.
But let's move away from dictionaries and see what the academics have to say. In the Rutledge Companion to Philosophy and Music, Dr. Andrew Kania defines it as
any event intentionally produced or organized to be heard, and either to have some basic musical feature, such as a pitch or rhythm, or to be listened to for such features.
That's a pretty dry definition, but basically what he's saying is that what makes something music is that it invites you to listen to it musically. That is, it asks you to listen for certain musical elements like pitch and rhythm, whether or not those elements are actually there. Tonya uses this to separate music, which cares about those elements, from sound art, which doesn't. It's pretty wordy though, so if we want to simplify, we can turn to the experimental composer Edgar Varese, who found himself frustrated with the way his work was being critiqued. Listeners would often say things like, "It's interesting, but is it music?" To which he responded,
"What is music but organized sound?"
And in just 2 words, he gets to the heart of Tonya's definition. But Varese doesn't draw the line between music and sound art, treating both as functionally equivalent. To my mind, this definition is actually a little overbroad in that it includes things like speech that we mostly wouldn't consider music, but maybe that's the point. So far, all our definitions have focused on the intentions of the musician, but that's only half the equation. Music isn't just made, it's also experienced, which brings me to Luciano Berio, who once said,
"Music is everything one listens to with the intention of listening to music."
I do really like how this definition centers music as a social construct whose boundaries are defined by convention and experience, not a list of technical requirements. That said, I don't love the emphasis on intention. If I walk into a subway station and there's a busker playing a violin, I haven't sought out a musical experience, but I've certainly found one. And by focusing solely on individual interpretation, Berio's definition leaves the possibility of taking something broadly recognized as music and declaring it not music simply because you choose not to hear it that way. This makes it difficult to create a shared picture of what music, and therefore genre, is. Also, this definition, like everything we've seen so far, treats music as exclusively sound. And that makes sense. Music is a sonic art form after all, but it can also be more than that. The obvious example is dance. In many cultures and scenes, dance is an integral part of musical engagement. Trying to understand a ballet, for instance, without considering the choreography would only tell you half the story. As such, my preferred definition is a slight modification of Berio's. To me, music is anything that people experience as musical. I sometimes get pushback on this definition because it's cyclical and you're not supposed to use a word in its own definition, and sure, that's fair. But it's also the point. Music doesn't exist, at least not in the sense we usually mean. It's not an object, like a table or an elephant or a Pikachu. Until music is experienced, it's literally nothing. If a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, is that a sick beat? No. And if music is created by experience, then it must also be defined by experience. We collectively choose which things to accept as music based on our intuitive understandings of what music is, and those intuitions change across time, across cultures, and importantly for this video, across genres. To my mind, any definition that doesn't respect that is bound to become obsolete pretty quickly. I'll get off my soapbox now. But there's an even more radical option, the definition Fabri himself uses, which defines music as
any type of activity performed around any type of event involving sound.
He credits this to the Italian semiologist Stefani, by which I assume he means Gino Stefani, but when I search the quote, all I find is references to Fabri, so who knows. And the implications of this definition are daunting. This is why I wanted to give you some other options. Sound is everywhere, so by removing any reference to intention or experience, Stefani forces us to describe pretty much everything as music. An auctioneer rattling off prices, the roar of engines at a NASCAR race, or a loud burp from your friend who just chugged a whole can of soda are all music. And it's worse than that. He also includes anything happening around that sound, so you buying a hot dog at the concession stand of that NASCAR race and then eating that hot dog is definitionally, unequivocally, music. So, yeah. Of course, this does have some upsides. Being so broad lets us easily consider not just the sounds of a genre, but all the secondary components like typical concert behavior. It gives us a handy way of explaining why you don't see mosh pits at the symphony. But still, personally, I prefer my definitions to have some sort of guardrails. But okay, whatever music means to you, hopefully you're ready to move on, because there's still a doozy lurking in Fabri's definition of genre. What does it mean for music to be governed by socially accepted rules? What are those rules, and who gets to decide if they're accepted? Well, the specifics vary wildly by genre, but Fabri spends a good chunk of the paper defining 5 different categories of rules to consider. This list isn't meant to be exhaustive, but it gives us a good sense of the kinds of things we're looking for. First up are the formal or technical rules. I'm not going to spend too much time on these because they're obvious. If you're trying to define a genre, these are the first things you'll reach for. They're the composition and performance practices that directly define what happens in the music. If I say the 5/1 resolution is classical, metal uses distorted guitars, and jazz is often played with a swing feel, those are all technical rules. In some cases, like with Baroque-era voice leading, these rules are explicit, written down somewhere and taught to new musicians as the correct way to participate in the tradition. In others, like rock guitar tone, the rules are more implicit. There's no objective authority defining the correct choice, but norms still develop over time as artists respond to and engage with each other in that shared genre space. But whether they're officially defined or not, understanding these rules is essential if you want to make music that feels like it belongs. And formal rules serve a very important function. They reduce complexity for listeners familiar with the genre. Every piece of music contains a lot of information, way too much to parse in real time. Like, check out Ashes by SBSM. If you're not familiar with modern no-wave, that was probably a little overwhelming. There's a lot going on, and without knowing how to filter it, it's hard to know what to focus on. Understanding the rules of a genre helps you determine which elements require attention, and gives you a set of tools to interpret those elements. In Just a Friend,
Oh, baby, you got what I need.
is Biz Markie singing out of tune because his intonation is bad? Is he making a bold microtonal choice? Or is he being sloppy on purpose? Is it even correct to say he's out of tune, or is that inappropriately applying rules from a different genre? And no, I'm not answering that for you. You've got to ask an old school hip-hop head. Next, we have the semiotic rules, which are about how the music conveys meaning. This can involve rules about specific musical gestures. A sudden drop in tempo means something very different in a metal breakdown than a pop rock earworm.
I'm trying hard to take it back, so if by the time the bar closes.
But it also covers the use of specific themes like love and war, and even the types of communication they prefer to use. For this, Fabry borrows an idea from the linguist Roman Jakobson, who proposed 6 functions of language. We can think of these as 6 kinds of things that a particular statement could be trying to talk about. Both Jakobson and Fabry argue that all 6 functions are always present, but different ones will be dominant in different circumstances, and certain genres of music are more likely to prioritize certain kinds of communication. The first of these is the referential function, which is when you're talking about a thing. That's pretty straightforward. Most music with lyrics does this to some extent, but it's particularly important in narrative genres like folk. The Lonely Death of Hattie Carroll,
Williams and Zinger killed poor Hattie Carroll with a cane that he twirled around his diamond ring finger.
is a story about people and events, and the structure of the music mostly stays out of its way. If the goal of a genre is to convey concrete information, that's referential. Next is the emotive function, which is when you're talking about yourself, specifically expressing your subjective feelings and experience. This is pretty common in pop music. The story of someone like you
Never mind, I'll find someone like you.
is strongly supported by musical choices that connect with our cultural vocabulary for sadness, while High Hopes
Had to have high hopes for a living, shooting for the stars when I couldn't make a killing.
is built from the ground up to convey excitement and confidence. If the goal of a genre is to portray a certain feeling, it's probably emotive. That also overlaps with conative function, where you're talking about the person you're speaking to, usually in the form of an instruction. We could look for these in lyrics, as in Bob Marley telling us to
Get up, stand up.
but I think a more appropriate comparison would actually be dance music. Good Times uses its infectious beat, driving groove, and even some of its lyrics to instruct you on how to move your body. If the goal of a genre is to get you to do something in response, that's conative. Fourth is the poetic function, where you're talking about the feel of the message, and it's probably best demonstrated by genres like progressive rock. Back in NYC,
As I cuddle the porcupine, keep set, I got not to blame but me.
is a rich, nuanced showpiece full of musical flourishes for their own sake. If the goal of a genre is to play around with the tools music provides, it's probably poetic. or it might be using the reflexive function, which talks about the communication medium itself. This is exemplified by the avant-garde with works like 433 and pendulum music that are the reason I had to spend so much time defining what music even is. If the goal of a genre is to make a statement about the nature of music itself, it's probably reflexive. And finally, there's the fadic function, which talks about nothing in particular. Think small talk, where you perform the act of communication without actually communicating anything meaningful. In music, this is mostly found in genres like elevator music that only exist because someone decided pure silence would be weird. But it's also a key principle of ambient music, a work like Music for Airports, invites you to listen without really hearing, and if you want to know more, It's Boundo has a great video about ambient music, link in the description. Point is, if the goal of a genre is to fade into the background, that's fadic. Understanding these semiotic rules can lead to some really interesting artistic choices. Consider Hey Ya. On the surface, it employs plenty of genre tropes that tell you to hear it as a conative dance piece, with a funky groove and a breakdown that implores you to shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it. But as many online listicles have pointed out by now, beneath that surface is a pretty heart-wrenching story of a relationship falling apart. That should be emotive, but it's hidden by the surrounding musical context, which Andre 3000 calls out in the line,
Y'all don't wanna hear me, you just wanna dance.
He's playing with the semiotic rules intrinsic to this style of hip-hop to make a deeper statement about the genre, which also makes it kind of reflexive. It's a brilliant song. Next on Fabri's list are the behavioral rules, and this is why those broader definitions are helpful. Genres aren't just a way of writing songs, after all. Genres are cultures, and they have their own social norms. This could mean proper concert behavior. Again, no mosh pits at the symphony. It could also mean fashion. Compare the flannel jackets of Kurt Cobain to the makeup and platform boots of Kiss. And it can even mean the language we use to describe the music we love. You may have heard that many jazz musicians don't like it when you call things jazzy. That's not a word that gets used in jazz culture, so it signifies that the speaker is an outsider to the genre and doesn't really understand what it's about. I'm also an outsider to the genre of jazz, so I'm not going to tell you what words you should use instead, but I will say that I get it. I mean, I made a whole video about the metal concept of heavy, and I know how I'd feel if I heard someone describe, say, Cannibal Corpse as metallic. It's just wrong. Or at least it's breaking the rules. Behavioral rules can tell us which sorts of performances to expect from artists. Fabry notes, for instance, that some genres care more than others about concepts like sincerity, and they define how participants approach musical environments. A jazz musician showing up to a jam session will be expected to know how to play certain standards, while fans of underground scenes might feel slighted if their favorite artists sign with a major label. This is also the set of rules most likely to create genre rivalries, like the mods and rockers, if avoiding one genre becomes an important rule in another. Demonstrating an understanding of the behavioral rules is a way of proving that you belong, that you can hang, and that you respect the genre enough to deserve its respect in return. Fans who get it are welcomed, while artists who fail to behave correctly risk being labeled fakers, sellouts, or plants. And continuing with culture, there's also social and ideological rules. If the behavioral rules tell you what the fans do, these tell you who the fans are. It's also where we find the overall vision for what the genre is supposed to be, which makes it sort of a meta rule that tells us what all our other rules are for. But Fabry is quick to clarify that he doesn't just mean demographics. It's true that dad rock is associated with boomers, musical theater with the queer community, and pop with teenage girls, but those associations aren't boundaries. There's nothing stopping you from liking or participating in those genres, even if you don't belong to the right group, as long as you behave correctly. But in some cases, that group becomes so important to the identity of a genre that it becomes a rule in and of itself. We can see this in many local punk scenes that build spaces specifically for poor and working class youths, in K-pop where the artists are definitionally Korean, and in modern country, which is full of outward signifiers of a conservative political project. In fact, country's a really interesting case study in the power of social rules to define genre. These days, it has a reputation as a very white genre of music, and that's not an accident. Back in the early 20th century, the white artists playing what would go on to be called country were very much in community with black blues musicians, and they played pretty much the same thing. Heck, the banjo, one of the most quintessential sounds in country, is an African instrument, or more precisely an adaptation of traditional African instruments by American slaves. But it was the early 20th century, and segregation was still very much the law of the land. To avoid the scandal of exposing young white audiences to black artists, the newly formed record industry separated out so-called hillbilly music from race records, forcibly separating the two groups and explicitly defining the genre that would become country by the color of its artist's skin. That divide eventually led country and blues to develop very differently, adding other technical, social, and semiotic rules that a century later have made them pretty clearly distinct genres. No one would confuse Blake Shelton
Devil went down to Georgia, but he didn't stick around. This is God's country.
for Christone Kingfish Ingram.
He said you would be there every step of the way.
But all those differences trace their roots back to early 20th century racism and the social rules it created. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but it is the history. That's also a good example of Fabry's last category, the economical and juridical rules. Or at least, I think it is. He doesn't really describe what he means here. The section is 2 paragraphs long, and mostly just says people don't talk about these, so I'm gonna have to do a bit of guesswork, but based on the examples he gives later in the paper, I think these are the rules that govern how the genre interacts with the broader culture that supports it. How does it survive and hopefully thrive in that legal and economic environment? That's a bit abstract, so let's try some examples. The modern concept of a symphony orchestra largely developed over the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe, first under the patronage system, where wealthy aristocrats would fund their own artists as a status symbol, and later through private donations and government subsidies. That's how we were able to get hundreds of people working full-time jobs to play one piece of music live. It was never meant to sustain itself on ticket sales alone, but these days, funding the arts isn't as popular for rich folks. Orchestras are having to adapt to that new reality by changing their business models, which affects their artistic choices. On the legal side, another good example is sampling. This is a foundational practice in hip-hop, arguably the foundational practice in hip-hop, but it's also illegal. Modern copyright law still largely relies on early 20th century ideas about song ownership, so artists who want to use samples need to make some tough choices. You could cut into your profits by paying the licensing fee, chop it up so much that it's not recognizable, give up and record a similar track on your own, or you can just do it anyway and be careful not to sell it anywhere you might get caught. Back in the 70s, when the mainstream wasn't paying attention, artists mostly did that last one, but now that hip-hop is an enormous global industry, they can't afford to take those risks anymore. There's too much money on the line, and again, that changes the art. And these rules are, I think, the ones driving the phenomenon Noah talked about in his video. Genre as we know it is dying because the last few decades have seen seismic shifts in the economic and legal landscapes of the music industry. That arguably started as early as mixtapes in the 80s, but it really kicked off in the early 2000s with the internet and, more importantly, file sharing. Services like LimeWire and Napster decimated a music industry that still relied mostly on sales of physical albums, and while they clawed some of that back through, like, the iTunes store, they never really recovered. And if that wasn't enough, the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated that change by temporarily shutting down live performance venues, cutting off another traditional revenue stream. This drove even more artists to online platforms like YouTube, Spotify, and TikTok that, much like symphony ticket sales, don't pay nearly enough to support the entire music industry on their own, leaving us stuck in a very strange aeon. You see, genres don't just pop up out of nowhere. As Fabry notes, new genres are incubated within the musical cultures of old ones, and they naturally inherit many of the rules of their parents. This creates a sort of continuity that connects genres throughout their history, and especially when it comes to economic systems, those roots run deep and they move very slowly. For the last century or so, our mainstream understanding of genre has been largely defined by the categories used by major record labels to sell records, but now those labels are dying, and our models of genre are dying with them. That doesn't mean genre is over, but it does mean we need a new framework, and I think what we're seeing now is the first step toward building it. Your move, Noah. Throughout this video, I've mostly been talking about relatively mainstream genres, and with good reason. I want my examples to make sense. But the downside is that every genre of popular music is actually pretty similar in some pretty important ways. They mostly all trace their roots back to the blues, after all, and they've all had to adapt to the commercial demands of the recording industry. If you really want to see how far these rules can push a genre, then we'll have to look further afield, and a good place to start would be danger music. This is an underground genre born out of the punk and noise scenes, and it's wild. My friend Philip from Volksgeist made a great video all about it, but in order to do the topic justice, he had to get into some kinda unsavory things that on YouTube would probably have got his video demonetized or even taken down. so instead, he put it on Nebula. Nebula is a streaming platform built by and for creators, so it gives us a lot more leeway to make the things we want to make without worrying whether an algorithm thinks advertisers will like it. And creators like Philip have done some amazing things with that freedom. That includes Danger Music, but also Maggie Mae Fish's Unrated series about sex in film, and Real Engineering's Battle of Britain, an in-depth look at the fight for Britain's skies in World War II. And that's just one side of Nebula. The site has recently undergone its biggest redesign ever, adding a bunch of new categories to help you find whatever you want to watch, and announcing a huge slate of new originals. I am particularly excited for Pigment of Your Imagination, a series about color by artist Sarah Renee Clark, and, of course, Identities, a sci-fi short film by Jesse Gender. Noah and I actually talked to Jesse about it on our podcast, and it sounds so good. And by the way, if you're a Ghost Notes listener, that episode with Jesse comes out tomorrow on Nebula, so sign up to check it out. And if you're not already a Nebula member, you can get a 40% discount on an annual plan with the link in the description, which comes out to just $250 a month, and a portion of that goes directly to me to help me keep making stuff. It's great. And hey, thanks for watching, and thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sungard, Howard Levine, Warren Hewitt, Damian Feller-Sutherland, John Hancock, Neil Moore, and Jeff. Don't forget to check out the Nebula cut for a fuller outro, and as always, keep on rockin'.